The snow had buried her up to her chest. Her red braids were stiff with ice, each strand sealed in frost, as though the winter itself had tried to preserve what her family had chosen to discard. Her fingers were blue. Her lips had gone the color of pale birchwood. She had stopped shaking some time ago, and in the bitter, godless wilderness of the northern lands, the moment a body stopped shaking was the moment it began to surrender. No one had come for her. No one ever came for an Omega. But then, hooves. A sound so deep it moved through the frozen ground before it ever reached her ears. The earth itself trembled, and when Vandrima Noxus forced her swollen eyes open against the weight of ice on her lashes, she saw him cutting through the snowfall like a blade through silk. Marcus Drimtorn, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. Astride a black destrier draped in wolf fur, his long golden hair catching the last breath of torchlight from the company of warriors that flanked him. He rode at the head of a war column, returning from the eastern borders, and he should have passed her without slowing. Every law of their world, every ancient custom carved into the bones of their kind, said he should have ridden past a dying Omega without a second glance. He did not. The column halted. The destrier's breath rose in great white clouds as the king dismounted before a single one of his warriors dared to speak. He walked through the snow with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his life needed to rush toward anything, because everything had always made way for him. And then he knelt, in the snow, before her. Marcus Drimtorn, who had brought 3 rival packs to their knees and redrawn the borders of the north with nothing but iron will and bared teeth. He knelt in the snow before a half-frozen girl that the world had thrown away. His gray eyes found hers, and something moved in them. Something old, something that had no name in any tongue she had ever learned.
You are mine.
Not a question, not a command issued from a throne. A recognition as simple and as devastating as the moment a man realizes he has been lost for years without knowing it, and suddenly understands which direction is home. Vandrima Noxus, abandoned and frozen and utterly forgotten, stared up at the most feared alpha in all the northern kingdoms, and felt for the first time in her 24 years of life that the cold had absolutely nothing to do with the winter. There was a memory Vandrima Noxus could never quite outrun, no matter how many winters passed or how many calluses formed on her hands from labor that was never truly hers to bear. She had been 7 years old. The great hall of Clan Noxus had smelled of pine resin and roasted meat that evening, and the firelight had turned everything amber and gold, the kind of gold that makes even ordinary things look sacred. Her mother, Sigrid Nilsson Noxus, had braided her hair with trembling fingers before the ceremony, weaving small copper beads into the red strands with a care that Vandrima, even at 7, had understood was less about love and more about performance. The clan was watching. The elder, a woman named Ylva Ekman, with teeth as yellow as old bone and eyes that had seen too many winters to be moved by anything as fragile as mercy, had placed her weathered hand against Vandrima's chest and closed her eyes. The hall had gone silent, not the comfortable silence of people holding their breath in anticipation of good news. The other kind. The silence of water pulling back from shore before a wave that means to destroy. Ylva Ekman had opened her eyes, and in the amber firelight, in the great hall of a clan that prided itself on warriors and strength and the iron currency of rank, she had spoken 2 words that landed like a stone into still water, the ripples of which, never, in 17 years, fully stopped. The elder announced to the gathered clan that the child carried the mark of an Omega. Vandrima remembered the sound her father made. It was not a shout. It was not a curse hurled at the gods or at the elder or at the universe that had apparently decided to make a joke at his expense. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse. A short exhale, a collapsing inward of a man who had spent years building a particular future in his mind, and now watched it dissolve like frost on a warm stone. Her father, Eric Johansson Noxus, a man of considerable pride and moderate achievement, simply deflated. And in deflating, he took with him every version of Vandrima's future that had ever existed in his imagination. Her mother said nothing. She removed the copper beads from Vandrima's hair the following morning with the same methodical precision with which one might clear a table after a meal, efficiently, without sentiment, as though the gesture had never carried meaning to begin with. Vandrima was 7 years old, and she understood, with the cruel clarity that only children are capable of, that something had ended before it had properly begun. She was not beaten. She was not locked away. She was not cast out into the snow. Not yet. That particular cruelty would require 17 more years of quiet accumulation before her family found the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to see it through. Instead, she was simply reduced. Steadily, the way a candle is reduced, not in one dramatic extinguishing, but by the slow, patient work of time and air and indifference. She was moved from the sleeping loft she had shared with her older brother Leif to a narrow straw pallet beside the hearth in the servants' corridor. Her meals were taken after the rest of the family had eaten. Her name, once spoken with something approaching warmth, became a word of function, called when labor was needed, ignored when it was not. And she had adapted. That was the thing about Vandrima Noxus that no one in her family ever quite reckoned with. She adapted. She learned to carry more than her size suggested she could. She learned to anticipate what was needed before being asked, because being asked carried in it a tone that she preferred to preempt. She learned to exist in the peripheral spaces of a life that was technically hers, like furniture that had been rearranged one too many times and now no longer seemed to belong to any particular room. She also, quietly and without ceremony, learned to survive. She learned which roots beneath the snow were edible and which were poison. She learned to read weather in the behavior of the ravens before the storm came. She learned to navigate the frozen river path to the market village in near darkness, because errands assigned to Omegas were often assigned at the worst possible hours, and she refused to die of cold on an errand for people who would replace her before the body had finished cooling. She learned her own body, how to push it, how to rest it, when to yield and when to insist. These were not the lessons her family had intended to teach her. They were the lessons the world had offered in place of the ones she had been denied. By the time she was 24, Vandrima Noxus was, in every way that mattered, and none of the ways her clan recognized, extraordinary. But the clan of Noxus did not deal in the currency of quiet extraordinary. They dealt in rank, in bloodline, in the visible markers of strength that an Omega, by definition, could not provide. And so, she remained what she had always been in their eyes, a blemish on an otherwise acceptable family record. A liability, dressed in a servant's tunic and red braids, carrying firewood across the courtyard in the dead of a northern winter as though she had been born for nothing else. It was on the morning of the Blood Moon Gathering that everything unraveled. The Blood Moon Gathering was the most significant event in the annual cycle of the Northern Clans, a 3-day assembly held in the territory of the reigning Alpha King, during which clans presented themselves, renewed their oaths of allegiance, settled disputes before the King's Council, and, perhaps most importantly, conducted the formal mate presentations. Young wolves of rank were brought before the gathered clans, in a ritual as old as the northern bloodlines themselves. Their eligibility declared, their prospects weighed. It was theater, mostly. The kind of theater in which everyone knew their role and performed it with a straight face, because the alternative, admitting that the entire architecture of their social order was built on ceremony and collective fiction, was simply too uncomfortable to contemplate. Clan Noxus was attending. Of course they were attending. Eric Johansson Noxus had arranged a minor alliance with a Western clan that was to be formalized at the gathering, and the family was dressing for the occasion with the focused energy of people who understood that appearances in this world were not decoration. They were survival. Vandrima had been awake since before dawn. She had loaded the travel sledge, packed the ceremonial furs, ensured the horses were fed and the ice on their hooves cleared, prepared the morning meal, and was in the process of carrying the last of the supply crates across the courtyard when her brother Leif, who had grown broad and self-satisfied in ways that 24 years of preferential treatment will produce in a person, appeared in the doorway of the hall and told her she would not be traveling with the family. She stopped walking. The crate was heavy. The air was cold enough to make her teeth ache. She looked at her brother and said nothing, waiting for the explanation. Not because she expected it to be reasonable, but because she had learned long ago that silence was the only response that didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He told her, with the casual cruelty of someone who had never once had to consider whether his words had weight, that the family had decided her presence at the gathering would be an embarrassment, that her rank would be noticed, that there were eyes at this particular gathering, important eyes, connected to the Western Clan Alliance, that did not need to fall on an Omega and draw the wrong kind of conclusions about the Noxus bloodline. He told her she was to remain behind and tend the hearth. He told her this the way one tells a dog to stay. Vandrima set the crate down. She set it down with care because she was not, despite everything, a person who threw things. And she looked at her brother with the particular expression she had spent 24 years perfecting, the one that gave nothing away, the one that looked almost like calm, the one that was actually something else entirely, something that lived too deep for his limited perception to reach. She told him she understood. And she did understand. She understood with absolute and devastating clarity that this was what it had always been moving toward. 17 years of reduction, of being made smaller and quieter and more peripheral with each passing season. And now, finally, even the pretense of her belonging to this family was being dropped like a piece of clothing that no longer fit and couldn't be mended. She tended the hearth. She did it thoroughly and without resentment, because resentment, she had found, was a fire that only burned the vessel that held it. She swept the hall, mended a tear in a wall hanging, ate the leftover porridge that no one else had wanted, and waited. The silence of an empty house in winter is a particular kind of silence, thick and cold and absolute, like being submerged in something that does not have a name. By midday, she had made a decision. She was not certain when, precisely, the decision crystallized. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment of clarity, no voice from the gods, no crack of thunder to punctuate the resolution. It was quieter than that, the way water decides, without ceremony, to find the lowest point. Vandrima Noxus looked at the hearth she had tended, and the hall she had cleaned, and the life she had been maintaining for 24 years, like a caretaker of a house that was never going to be hers. And she understood that if she did not leave, today, now, before the family returned, she was going to disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way she had always been disappearing. A little more with each winter, until one day there would simply be nothing left of her that was recognizably herself. She packed what was hers. It was not much. A wool cloak, a small knife her grandmother had left her, the only member of the Noxus family who had ever seemed to see her clearly, and who had died when Vandrima was 12, taking with her the last warmth the family had ever reliably produced. A portion of dried meat, a fire-starting kit. Her grandmother's comb, bone-handled, which she tucked into the inner pocket of her cloak with the careful reverence one reserves for things that are irreplaceable. She left through the back of the house because even in this she was a creature of the peripheral, and she walked north. Not because north was where she intended to go, precisely, but because north was away. And away was the only direction that felt, in that moment, like a direction at all. The snow had been falling since mid-morning. By the time Vandrima cleared the boundary markers of the Noxus territory and entered the open passage between clan lands, the long, unmarked corridor of frozen forest and windswept plain that connected their holdings to the King's Road, It was falling with the focused intent of a winter that had decided it had been gentle long enough. The cold moved through her cloak within the first hour. By the second hour, it had moved through her skin. By the third, it had arrived somewhere deeper, the place beneath muscle and bone where a body keeps its last reserves of warmth, the final room in a house that is slowly going dark. She kept walking. She told herself she would reach the road. She told herself that once she reached the King's Road, there would be travelers, merchants, warriors, pilgrims, braving the season for reasons of their own, and that she would find passage somewhere, to something, to a life that did not require her to be invisible in order to survive. She told herself this with the persistent, slightly desperate optimism of someone who understands on some level that they are lying to themselves but cannot afford to stop. The trees thinned. The wind found her more easily without them, and it was not kind about it. Her braids had gone rigid with ice. The feeling in her fingers had moved from pain to numbness in the manner of a mercy that carried its own threat. She had been walking for what she estimated was close to 4 hours, when her legs, which had been loyal to her for 24 years of service, made a quiet and final argument for rest that she did not have the reserves to counter. She went down into the snow, not with a fall, but with a settling, a gradual yielding, like a flame lowering itself. She sat first. Then, because sitting required an effort of balance, her body was no longer willing to sustain. She sank sideways into the drift at the roadside, and the snow received her with the indifferent hospitality of something that has no preference between the living and the dead. The cold, she noticed, had stopped feeling like cold. It felt now like weight, like the particular heaviness of sleep after labor, a heaviness that did not feel entirely unwelcome. Her vision had narrowed. The falling snow above her had become a moving ceiling, white and absolute and oddly beautiful. She thought, with the detached clarity of a mind that has passed through fear and come out the other side into something quieter, that she had never actually looked at falling snow from below, that it was, from this angle, quite remarkable. She thought about her grandmother's comb. She thought that it was a shame she had not made it further. She thought, very briefly, in the thin and fading corridor between consciousness and whatever came after, that she had never, not once in 24 years, been chosen. Not for warmth, not for pride, not for love, not for anything at all. That she had spent her entire life being the thing that was left behind when everyone else had taken what they wanted. And that perhaps the cruelest joke of it was that even now, at the end, she was alone in a way that had no witnesses. The sound reached her before the light did. Hooves. The ground shook. And Vandrima Noxus, who had stopped shaking long ago, who had given up the effort of keeping her eyes open because the snow above her was very white and very still and required nothing of her, forced them open one last time, because something in the ancient and stubborn architecture of her survival refused, even now, to go without looking. The torchlight hit the snow around her like a second sunrise. And at its center, dismounting from a black destrier with the unhurried certainty of a man who commanded the ground he walked on, was a figure she recognized from stories. From the war songs the clanmen sang when they'd had enough mead to be honest about the things they feared. Long, golden hair, a frame that the word broad could not quite contain. Gray eyes, she could see them even in the torchlight, even from the snow, even through the ice on her lashes, that were currently fixed on her with an expression she had no frame of reference for, because no one had ever looked at her like that, like she was the reason they had stopped.
Get the healer now.
The command was not loud. It did not need to be. It moved through the assembled warriors the way a stone moves through water, immediate, total, without negotiation. And Marcus Drimtorn, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, knelt in the snow before her, and the world tilted on an axis that Vandrima could not name. His hand, bare, warm, impossibly warm against the frozen ruin of her face, cupped her jaw with a gentleness that seemed, in a man of his size and reputation, almost structurally impossible.
Stay awake. I need you to stay awake.
She wanted to tell him that was easy for him to say. That he had not just spent 4 hours walking into a northern winter with nothing but a wool cloak and dried meat, and the particular kind of stubbornness that forms in a person when stubbornness is the only inheritance they are ever given. She wanted to say something sharp and self-sufficient, something that would establish immediately that she was not, despite current appearances, the kind of woman who needed saving. Instead, because her lips were no longer entirely cooperating with her intentions, what came out was considerably smaller.
I was not sleeping.
Something moved across Marcus Drimtorn's face. It was gone before she could read it properly. Before she could determine whether it was surprise or amusement or something else entirely. He said nothing. He simply removed his cloak, the great wolf fur cloak that had probably kept him warm through campaigns in territories where men had frozen solid in their armor, and wrapped it around her with the focused efficiency of someone who has made a decision and sees no reason to discuss it. She heard his warriors behind him. She heard the shift of leather and the creak of saddles, and what she was almost certain was someone failing to fully suppress a sound of surprise. She did not blame them. Their king was currently kneeling in a snowdrift, wrapping his cloak around an omega he had found at the roadside. If she were them, she would also be having a complicated reaction. The warmth of the cloak hit her like a physical blow. Like the first breath after surfacing from very cold water. Her body, which had been steadily closing itself down, made a surprised and involuntary decision to reconsider. She felt his arms go beneath her, lifting her with the ease of someone for whom her weight was not even a minor consideration, and she was briefly and entirely furious about how dignified she was not, being carried like something rescued from a river, red braids stiff with ice and cheeks so cold she could feel nothing in them, and the general appearance of a woman who had been definitively defeated by a snowdrift.
I can walk.
You cannot.
I was walking perfectly well before
You stopped walking and began waiting to die in a snowbank.
There was no particular heat in the way he said it. No condescension, no mockery, just a plain and unhurried delivery of fact that landed in a way that made argument feel genuinely pointless. She closed her mouth. This was not, she told herself firmly, surrender. This was strategic silence in the face of irrefutable accuracy. The healer, a compact, quick-moving woman named Mira Larson, who moved through the snow toward them at speed, arrived and began assessing Vandrima with brisk, efficient hands, asking her to follow a torchlight with her eyes and confirm she could feel her feet, all while conspicuously not looking at the king kneeling in the snow beside her, which suggested that Mira Larson was a woman of considerable professional discipline. Vandrima followed the light. She confirmed the feat. She endured the examination with the focused dignity of someone who has decided that dignity, at this point, is the only thing left to defend. The camp was close, a temporary installation the King's Column had established on their march back from the eastern border, half a league up the road. She was brought there in the arms of the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, which was an experience so entirely outside any framework her life had previously provided that she was not certain her mind was processing it accurately. She was installed in a tent that was warmer than any room she had occupied in recent memory. Blankets were brought. Broth was brought. The healer returned with medicines for the cold sickness and instructions that were delivered to a warrior who had been stationed outside the tent's entrance, which suggested that her being kept warm and alive was, for reasons she could not yet fathom, considered a matter of some priority. She lay in the warmth and the quiet and the impossible unfamiliarity of being somewhere that no one seemed to want her to disappear from, and she thought about this very carefully. She was an omega. She was no one's ally, no one's prize, no one's asset. She had nothing, no rank, no clan affiliation that currently felt operative, no visible reason for a king to have removed his cloak in a snowstorm and carried her to his camp like something precious. And yet, she was here, warm, alive, in the Alpha King's camp, in the Alpha King's cloak, which still smelled of pine and iron and something deeper, something that her Omega senses, impaired as they currently were by cold and exhaustion, nonetheless identified with an immediacy that bypassed thought entirely. An identification so old it lived below language, below choice. She pulled the cloak tighter. Outside the tent, she could hear the camp settling into its evening rhythms, the low exchange of voices, the sound of horses, the distant crack of firewood. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the sounds of a world continuing to operate without particular regard for the fact that everything inside her had shifted in a way she did not yet have words for. She did not know what he wanted. She did not know what she was, here, in this place, whether she was a guest or a curiosity or something else entirely. She did not know what morning would bring, or what she would say when she was required to explain herself, or what her family would do when they returned to find her gone, or whether any of it mattered in any direction she could currently predict. What she knew was this. She had walked out of a life that had been shrinking her, steadily and without apology, for 24 years. She had walked into a snowstorm with nothing but a wool cloak and a bone comb, and the stubborn, unreasonable insistence on remaining herself despite every evidence that herself was not particularly wanted. And somehow, impossibly, she had ended up here. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep, not the gray, surrendering slide into cold she had experienced in the snowdrift, but the deep and restorative sleep of a body that has finally, after a very long time, been given permission to rest. She did not hear the king enter the tent some time later. She did not see him stand at the entrance for a long moment, looking at the shape of her beneath his cloak, the red braids still half frozen, the slow, even rise and fall of her breathing, the particular quality of her face in sleep, which was not the face of someone who had stopped fighting, but of someone who had, just for a moment, chosen to put the fight down. She did not see his expression, which was perhaps just as well, because Marcus Drimtorn, who had not been uncertain about anything in longer than he could accurately recall, was looking at a sleeping Omega he had pulled from a snowdrift on the King's Road and feeling something he had no precedent for, something that had arrived not like a decision, but like a recognition, clear and complete and entirely without his permission. He stayed at the entrance of the tent for precisely as long as it took him to understand that this was not going away. Then he turned, walked back out into the cold, and said nothing to the warrior stationed there, because nothing needed to be said, because some things, once they have arrived, require no announcement. The snow kept falling, the camp burned through the night, and Vandrima Noxus slept on in the warmth of a king's cloak, dreaming of nothing, which was, after 24 years, the most extravagant luxury she had ever been given. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will touch your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and something roasting, something that involved fat dripping onto open flame, which her body, operating on dried meat and stubbornness for the better part of a day, responded to with an enthusiasm that bypassed dignity entirely. For one long, unguarded moment, Vandrima Noxus did not remember where she was. She registered warmth first, not the thin, provisional warmth of a hearthside pallet in a house that tolerated her presence, but a deep, encompassing warmth, the kind that reaches the places in a body that have been cold for so long they have forgotten they were ever anything else. She registered weight next, something heavy across her, dense and soft at once, smelling of pine and iron and something darker beneath both, something that her senses catalogued before her mind had properly come online. The cloak. Memory arrived in a sequenza that her still waking mind could barely process. The snow, the road, the 4 hours of walking that had ended with her sinking sideways into a drift with the resigned acceptance of someone who has run out of alternatives. The hooves, the torchlight, the gray eyes that had looked at her like she was the reason the column had stopped. She sat up. The tent was larger than she had registered the previous night, her perception having been compromised by hypothermia and the general cognitive impairment of someone who had nearly frozen to death in a snowbank. It was furnished with the efficient austerity of a man who traveled often and had long since stopped pretending that comfort was a weakness. A sleeping pallet of layered furs against one wall, a campaign table bearing maps, and a sealed correspondence pouch. A brazier burning steadily in the center. The cloak, which she was still wrapped in, was the most extravagant thing in the space. She was alone. This was, she decided, a mercy. It gave her approximately 4 minutes to locate her bearings, assess her physical condition, fingers functional, feet intact, face restored to something approximating normal sensation, pride only partially recoverable, and determine a course of action before she was required to interact with anyone. Her course of action was interrupted by the tent flap opening. The woman who entered was compact and brisk and carrying a wooden tray with the focused energy of someone who had a great many things to do and was choosing to do this one first. Mira Larson, the healer, Vandrima recognized her from the previous night's examination, set the tray down on the campaign table and looked at Vandrima with the direct, unsentimental assessment of a woman who dealt in physical realities and had no patience for theater. The healer informed her that her extremities had recovered fully, that she showed no signs of the deep cold sickness that sometimes followed exposure of that duration, and that she had apparently been kept alive as much by stubbornness as by the king's intervention, which she said with a tone that suggested she found this more admirable than she was professionally obligated to let on. On the tray, bread, still warm, a bowl of broth with meat, a cup of something that smelled of pine and honey. Vandrima looked at the tray, then at Mira, then at the tray again. The healer told her to eat, with the patient authority of someone accustomed to people who argued with sensible advice, and left before Vandrima could formulate a response. She ate. She was not proud of how quickly she ate, but she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that pride and dried meat had their limits, and she had exceeded both the previous evening. The broth was extraordinary, seasoned with herbs she couldn't fully identify, rich in a way that suggested whoever was responsible for the king's campaign kitchen either genuinely cared about their work or was very afraid of the consequences of mediocrity. She was finishing the last of the bread when the second visitor arrived. He was not the king. He was a young warrior, barely older than she was, with the kind of broad shoulders that suggested he had grown into them recently and was still occasionally surprised by doorframes, who delivered a message with the slightly rehearsed quality of someone who had been told what to say and was determined to say it correctly. He informed her that the Alpha King requested the honor of her presence at the evening banquet, that a change of clothing had been arranged, that a basin of warm water for washing had been placed outside the tent. He then stood very still, waiting. Vandrima considered this. An invitation from an Alpha King was, technically, not an invitation. The language of honor and request was the decorative wrapping on something that was, in practice, a direction. She understood this. She also understood that she was currently in his camp, wearing his cloak, having been delivered from a snowdrift by his hands, and that the architecture of obligation she had found herself inside was complex enough to warrant careful navigation. She told the young warrior to convey her acceptance. He looked briefly relieved, which told her the alternative outcome had been considered, and he personally had not been looking forward to reporting it. The change of clothing was, and she spent a moment genuinely uncertain how to respond to this, not a servant's tunic. It was a dress of deep green wool, simply cut but of a quality of fabric that Vandrima associated with people for whom fabric quality was a matter of course, rather than aspiration. A belt of dark leather, boots, correctly sized, which raised a question about how her measurements had been obtained that she chose not to examine too closely. No copper beads for her hair, but the comb she had packed, her grandmother's bone-handled comb, was still in the inner pocket of her cloak, and she worked it through her stiff braids with the methodical patience of a woman who had been combing ice from her own hair since she was old enough to do it herself. She looked at her reflection in the polished surface of a bronze shield that was propped against the tent wall, the only available mirror substitute, and considered the result. She looked, she thought, like someone who had nearly died yesterday and had spent significant effort this morning to ensure it wasn't obvious. Under the circumstances, she was prepared to count this as a success. The evening came down over the camp like a curtain, purple and sudden, the kind of northern dusk that does not bother with gradation. The torches were lit before full dark arrived, and the camp transformed. The functional installations of a traveling war column softened by firelight into something that had, if not elegance, at least warmth. The banquet tent was the largest structure in the camp. Its sides rolled partially up to allow the fire heat to circulate, long tables arranged within, and the smell of the feast preceding any visual confirmation of its existence by a considerable distance. Vandrima could hear voices, the low, overlapping register of warriors at ease, punctuated occasionally by laughter. She paused outside the entrance. She was aware, with complete and slightly uncomfortable clarity, that she was an Omega about to walk into a banquet full of alpha warriors at the invitation of their king. That this was not a social situation for which her 24 years of peripheral existence had provided relevant preparation. That whatever this evening was, it was not nothing, because nothing did not require a change of clothing and a warm basin and a formally delivered invitation. She walked in. The noise did not stop, which she appreciated. A room going silent upon her entrance would have been its own particular form of humiliation, the social equivalent of a spotlight, and she had endured enough spotlights in her life to find them more exhausting than flattering. The room continued its business, with the minor adjustment of several pairs of eyes tracking her passage through the tables with the interest of people who had heard a story and were now having the opportunity to evaluate the primary subject of it in person. She found him immediately. This was not, she told herself, a product of any particular sensitivity or attention on her part. He was simply the largest person in the room and occupied the position of highest architectural significance. The head of the main table, a great chair rather than a bench, maps and a wine cup before him, 2 senior warriors engaged in conversation on either side. He was not wearing armor. He wore dark wool and leather, simpler than she might have expected, and his golden hair was unbound and fell past his shoulders with the relaxed certainty of something that required no arrangement to be significant. He was looking at her, not with the curiosity of the other eyes in the room, the assessing, cataloging attention of people encountering a novelty, with something quieter than that, something that had, she thought, the quality of recognition rather than discovery. She walked to the table. He stood. Not entirely, not the formal, theatrical rising of a king performing ceremony, but a partial movement, enough to indicate that her approach was something he was meeting rather than receiving. He gestured to the seat beside him, not across, beside. She sat. The proximity was immediate and involuntary in its effect, the warmth of him, even across the distance of a chair's width, reaching her before any word was exchanged. She looked at the table. Food was being brought. The same extraordinary kitchen she had encountered that morning, apparently operating at full capacity now, platters of roasted meat and root vegetables and bread, arriving in an organized sequence that suggested someone had been planning this with some investment of intention. He did not speak immediately. She appreciated this as well, because she had been in the company of powerful men who could not tolerate silence and felt compelled to fill it with the sound of themselves, and it was not an experience that had ever made her feel particularly comfortable. Marcus Drimtorn appeared to have no difficulty with silence. He occupied it the way he occupied space. Completely, without apology, without any apparent need for external confirmation that he was doing it correctly. She picked up her cup. Pine and honey. The same drink from that morning.
The healer tells me you were walking north.
It was not a question, precisely. It had the quality of an observation that was also carefully an opening, the kind of conversational entry that was genuine, rather than tactical, which was, in her experience, considerably rarer than it should be.
I was.
North is wilderness. For another 3 days' walk in any direction.
I'm aware of what north is.
A pause. She kept her eyes on the table, on the cup in her hands, and felt, rather than saw, the slight shift in his attention, the fractional recalibration of a man reassessing an assumption.
Where were you going?
Away.
Away is not a destination.
It is when the alternative is staying.
This time, the silence had a different texture. She looked up, because not looking up felt like a concession she was not prepared to make, and found him watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of attention. Not the performing attention of someone waiting for their next opportunity to speak, but the real kind. The kind that actually takes in what it encounters.
Who left you on the road?
The question was quiet. It was also, beneath the quietness, not entirely quiet. She considered the question and everything contained within it. The answer, which was simple and humiliating in equal measure, and what it would mean to give that answer to this particular man in this particular context. She was not naive. She understood that information shared with an Alpha King was not information that remained private. She understood that naming her family was naming a clan, and that whatever Marcus Drimtorn decided to do with that information was outside her jurisdiction to control. She also understood, looking at him across the distance of a chair's width, that he already knew. That someone in a camp this organized and a column this experienced had already done the work of asking relevant questions. Where the woman on the King's Road had come from, who her people were, what had placed her in a snowdrift on a night when the temperature had been genuinely dangerous. That this question was not a request for information he lacked. It was something else.
My family believed it was the practical choice.
Practical.
I am an Omega. I represent a cost they were no longer willing to sustain.
She said it evenly. Not without pain. She was not. Underneath all the adaptation and the survival, and the 24 years of making herself smaller, without pain. But she had long since learned to hold pain at the same distance as weather. Present, acknowledged, not in control of what she did next. What she had not anticipated was his reaction. Nothing in his face changed, nothing visible, nothing that could be cataloged and reported. But something shifted in the quality of the air between them, something that her senses registered before her mind had assembled the words for it, like the particular change in pressure before a storm that does not announce itself until it arrives. He said nothing for a moment. Then he lifted his cup and drank. And when he set it down, the moment had passed, or at least had been put somewhere. It would not interfere with the evening.
You said you could walk.
The shift in subject was so complete that she nearly missed it. And then she understood that this was intentional, that he was giving her the particular mercy of not making her sit in the previous answer any longer than necessary. She felt something move in her chest, small, warm, unexpected.
I was walking.
In the wrong direction, in inadequate clothing, in a storm.
The direction was correct. The storm was poorly timed.
And the clothing?
I had a cloak,
Which was insufficient.
which was what I had.
He looked at her. And then, and this was the thing she would return to later, alone in the quiet of the tent and examine from multiple angles to ensure she had perceived it correctly. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a full expression, barely a suggestion of one. But it was there, and it was unmistakably not displeasure. Around them the banquet continued. Warriors ate and argued and laughed at things she couldn't hear from this end of the table. A man she recognized as one of the senior commanders, Henrik Berg, broad-chested with the kind of beard that suggested he had given up making decisions about it, glanced in their direction with an expression of transparent curiosity that he was making insufficient effort to conceal, caught the king's peripheral attention, and immediately redirected his gaze to his plate with impressive speed. Food was placed before her. She ate with the self-possession of someone who was aware of being observed and had made a decision not to perform either discomfort or gratitude. She ate because the food was there and she was hungry, and it would be irrational to do otherwise. These were the terms on which she intended to operate. He asked about the braids. It was entirely unexpected. So far outside the territory of any conversational direction, she had been anticipating that she actually looked at him to confirm the question had been asked.
The copper beads. You had them in your hair last night. They're gone now.
She touched her braid without meaning to, an involuntary gesture. She lowered her hand immediately.
My mother put them in when I was 7, for a ceremony. She took them out the following morning.
She had not meant to say that much. The information had come out with the ease of something that had been kept too long in a closed space, and, given the first reasonable opening, moved toward light instinctively. She pressed her mouth together slightly. He did not push. He did not ask the follow-up question that the answer obviously invited. He simply absorbed the information and looked at his cup, and she had the peculiar experience of feeling that she had been heard without feeling exposed. A distinction she had not previously understood was possible. The evening deepened around them. The torches burned lower. Somewhere in the camp, someone had produced an instrument, a stringed thing, low and resonant, and the sound of it drifted through the rolled-up sides of the tent with the quality of something that did not require permission to be beautiful. Warriors at the far end of the table had entered into the particular relaxed territory that follows enough mead and sufficient food, their voices lower and less deliberate. Henrik Berg had apparently forgiven himself for the earlier moment of visible curiosity, and was now engaged in what appeared to be an involved debate with the man beside him, complete with illustrative gestures. She and Marcus had not spoken again for some time, and this was the thing she could not quite account for. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had none of the charged, loaded quality of silences that are full of things not being said. It had, instead, the quality of shared space. Of two people who were, for reasons neither had yet articulated, simply at ease with the fact of each other's presence. This alarmed her more than anything that had been said. She was aware that she was an Omega at a king's table by his personal invitation, wearing clothing that had been arranged specifically for her, eating food from his campaign kitchen, wrapped in the residual warmth of a situation that no framework from her previous life had prepared her to interpret. She was aware that this was the most she had been treated like a person in longer than she could reliably remember, and that this should probably terrify her, because things that arrived without explanation in a life defined by deprivation had historically been either mistakes or debts.
Why am I here?
She asked it quietly into the middle distance, not quite at him. Direct enough to be honest. Oblique enough to be survivable if the answer was something she didn't want to hear at full volume. He turned to look at her. She felt it before she saw it.
Because I asked you to be.
That is not an explanation.
No.
Then what is?
He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for words. He did not appear to be a man who had to search particularly hard for words when he decided to use them. The quiet of someone choosing carefully. Of someone who was accustomed to a great deal of precision and was applying it here.
Some things do not have explanations yet. They have only the certainty that they are real.
She had no answer for that. She was not sure one existed, not in any language she currently had access to. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the music from somewhere in the camp moved between them like something alive, and the torches burned their quiet amber, and the northern sky above the rolled-up walls of the tent was the particular deep blue-black of a winter night, so clear and cold it had no room for anything but stars. She looked away first, not because she wanted to. Later, when the banquet had concluded and the camp had settled into its nighttime register, lower, slower, the sounds of a large body of people releasing the organization of the day into something more instinctive. She walked back through the torchlit corridors between tents with the steady gait of someone who is not running, even though some part of her very much wants to. The cold hit her at the tent line, sharp and immediate, and she paused in it for a moment, looked up at the stars, breathed. There was a word in the old northern tongue, a word her grandmother had taught her on a winter night not unlike this one, sitting by the hearth with the bone comb moving through Vandrima's hair and her grandmother's voice low and unhurried. The word was untranslatable in any strict sense. It meant, approximately, the feeling of standing at the edge of something whose size you cannot yet determine. She had not thought of that word in years. She thought of it now. Behind her, from across the camp, she heard his voice, just one exchange, low, with one of his commanders, and her entire body oriented toward the sound the way water orients toward downhill. Involuntary, complete, undeniable. She walked faster. She did not sleep for a long time that night, lying in the warmth of the tent with her grandmother's comb in her hand, and the sound of the camp settling into quiet around her, and a feeling in her chest that was entirely new and entirely without precedent, and considerably more frightening than the snowdrift had been. At least the snowdrift, she thought, had been something she understood. And somewhere on the other side of the camp, in the command tent with its maps and its campaign correspondence, and the weight of a kingdom that rested on him with the ease of long practice, Marcus Drimtorn sat alone in the dark a great deal longer than was his custom, and thought about a woman who had told him she was walking north and meant away, and had said it without self-pity or performance, as though it were simply the most accurate description available. He had known many people in his 32 years. He had known warriors and kings and enemies and counselors, and those who performed loyalty, and those who had actually earned the word. He had known them all in the way that a man who has occupied power since early adulthood comes to know people, with the particular, slightly exhausted clarity of someone who has seen enough to anticipate most of what a person will be before they have finished introducing themselves. He had not anticipated her. And in the quiet of the command tent, with the fire burning low and the northern dark pressing at the walls, Marcus Drimtorn found her, so entirely without precedent that he sat with it for a long time, the way one sits with something that cannot be resolved and therefore must simply be inhabited. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The stars pressed through the cleared sky with the aggressive brightness of things that had been waiting their turn. And somewhere between his tent and hers, in the frozen air of a winter camp at the edge of the northern wilderness, something had been set in motion that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. But the night was keeping its counsel, and morning, in the north, always came. The camp had not yet fully woken when Marcus appeared at the entrance of her tent. She knew it was him before the tent flap moved. This was a fact she filed away with the careful, slightly unnerved precision of someone cataloging evidence of something they are not yet ready to name, the way her body had, in the short span of less than 24 hours, already learned the specific quality of his presence, the particular weight of it in the air, the way the space around her seemed to reorganize itself, subtly and without permission, whenever he was near. She was already awake. She had been awake for some time, lying in the dark with her grandmother's comb in her hand, and her thoughts moving in circles that were becoming neither productive nor restful, and she had given up on sleep approximately an hour before dawn with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who understood that forcing rest was more exhausting than abandoning the attempt. He spoke from outside, not entering, which she noted.
There is something I want to show you, if you are willing.
She sat up. Considered this for precisely the length of time it took her to determine that no reasonable interpretation of the invitation was dangerous, and that her instincts, which had kept her alive through 24 years of circumstances that occasionally argued against survival, were not sounding any alarm worth heeding. She told him she would be a moment. She dressed in the green wool from the previous evening because it was the only option available to her that wasn't her original cloak, now cleaned and returned, but still carrying the particular psychological weight of the night she had worn it into a snowdrift. She worked her braids back into order with the bone comb, methodical, patient, the repetitive motion of it settling something in her that the sleepless hours had unsettled. She tucked the comb away, breathed once, deliberately, and stepped outside. The camp at this hour was a different creature than it was by day. Quieter, more honest, the performance of organized military function replaced by the simple reality of people sleeping and breathing and existing without the structure that daylight imposed. A few figures moved at the perimeter. A fire burned at the cook station where someone was already working on the morning meal. The sky above was the deep, particular blue that exists only in the last minutes, before dawn makes its argument, a blue so dense it was almost a color that required a name of its own. He was standing a short distance from the tent entrance, and he was, for the first time she had seen him, entirely alone. No warriors at his flank, no commanders in his peripheral field, no column of bodies that traveled with a king the way weather travels with a season. Just him, in the cold, watching her emerge from the tent with an expression that was, she thought, more unguarded than any she had seen on him yet, as though the hour and the solitude had loosened something. He was carrying 2 fur-lined cloaks. He held one out to her without speaking, and she took it and pulled it around herself. And they walked out of the camp together in the direction of the river. The path to the Drim was not long, half a league at most through a corridor of abettes so old and dense that they turned the pale pre-dawn light into something filtered and blue, the snow on their branches undisturbed and pristine, the silence between the trees so complete it had texture. Vandrima walked beside him rather than behind, because walking behind was a posture her body had spent 24 years performing, and she had made a quiet decision somewhere between the tent and the tree line that she was not going to perform it here. He did not seem to expect it. He walked at a pace that matched hers without appearing to calculate the adjustment, which told her either that he was more attentive than he let on, or that the pace simply felt natural. She was not certain which possibility was more disorienting. The river announced itself before they reached it. Not with sound, because the Drim in deep winter was silent, its voice locked beneath ice, but with the particular quality of light that open water, even frozen, throws back at the sky. They emerged from the tree line onto the bank, and she stopped. It was extraordinary. The Drim had frozen in a winter of unusual violence, and the result was ice that had not had time to settle into the smooth opacity of a gradual freeze. It was layered, fractured in places, the pressure of its own making having forced ridges and peaks along the surface like a miniature mountain range caught mid-formation. And the dawn, arriving now with its first pale suggestion of color at the eastern horizon, was hitting that surface in a way that turned the entire river into something that seemed to generate its own light, blue-white and iridescent, shifting as the light shifted, alive in the way that only things which are technically not alive can sometimes be. She did not speak. She was not sure she had words that were adequate to the task, and she had learned long ago that words deployed in the absence of adequacy were worse than silence.
I found it 3 mornings ago before the column moved on.
His voice was different at this hour. Lower, less organized somehow, or rather, organized differently, stripped of the particular precision that power requires of a man's voice in public, and left with something that sounded more like what a voice actually is, underneath all the things it is required to perform.
You came out alone to look at it?
I do that sometimes when the camp is quiet.
Come to look at rivers?
Come to find things that don't require anything of me.
She looked at him. He was watching the river, his profile clean against the lightening sky, the golden hair loose around his shoulders in a way that the daylight hours would never permit. Too exposed, too unguarded for a man who wore his authority like a second skin. Here, in the blue of early morning with no one watching, he looked less like a king and more like a person. The distinction she was discovering was larger than she had anticipated.
I would not have thought that was something you needed.
Everyone needs it.
Not everyone has the option of walking away from what requires things of them.
She said it without sharpness, not as a challenge, but as an observation. The difference between the two was something she had learned to maintain carefully, because observation invited conversation and challenge invited defense, and she had no interest in defense this morning. She was too tired, and the river was too beautiful, and the hour was too honest for anything that required walls. He turned to look at her.
Nolan, not everyone does.
A beat. He looked back at the river. Then, after a moment, he moved, walked to a flat-topped boulder at the river's edge, brushed the snow from its surface with one gloved hand, and sat. It was such an unceremonious, unheroic gesture, a man brushing snow off a rock so he could sit on it, that she almost smiled. She walked to the boulder and sat beside him, close enough that the cold between them was replaced by the warmth of proximity, far enough that it was still a choice rather than an assumption. The river glowed. The sky continued its slow transformation, the deep blue giving way, at the eastern edges to something warmer, the first suggestion of the amber that would eventually, in a few minutes, announce itself as dawn properly arrived. The abets behind them held their silence. Somewhere distant, a raven called once and went quiet.
Tell me something true.
She didn't know why she said it. It came out the way things came out at this hour, in this quality of light, without the usual layer of consideration she applied to her own words. She felt him go still beside her, not with tension, but with the particular stillness of someone who has been surprised in a way they find interesting.
Something true.
Something you wouldn't say at the table, with everyone watching.
The silence stretched. Long enough that she thought perhaps she had miscalculated, had moved into territory that the hour did not, despite appearances, actually permit. And then he spoke.
I have been Alpha King since I was 19 years old. My father died in the Third Border War, and I took the mantle before I had finished growing into the one before it. I have spent 13 years being what this territory requires me to be, and I have done it well enough that people have forgotten it cost anything.
She said nothing. He continued, and his voice had the quality of something being said for the first time. Not confessed, because there was no guilt in it, but articulated. Made real by the act of language in the way that things sometimes need to be.
I do not regret it. The work matters, and I am suited to it, and I would not change the shape of it. But there are mornings, this kind of morning before the camp wakes and the column forms and the day requires me. When I come to a place like this and remember that I am also just a man who finds frozen rivers beautiful and has no particular obligation for this 1 hour to be anything else.
The last of the blue drained from the sky, and the amber arrived, golden and sudden, and the river caught it and threw it back in a cascade of light that moved across the ice like something breathing. Vandrima watched it and felt the warmth of it on her face and understood, in the particular way that some moments make themselves immediately and permanently unforgettable while they are still happening, that this was one of those.
That is a very true thing.
Your turn.
She glanced at him. He was looking at the river, but there was the particular quality of his attention that she was coming to recognize, the presence of it, even when it was directed elsewhere. She looked back at the ice.
I used to pretend when I was small that the omega mark was a mistake, that someone had miscounted or misfiled or confused me with someone else and would eventually come to correct the error. I kept waiting to be corrected. I stopped waiting somewhere around 13.
And then,
And then I decided that if the world had assigned me the wrong category, the world was going to have to manage that disappointment without my participation.
He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than it had been.
how long did it take you to believe that?
She almost said immediately. She stopped herself, because this was a morning for true things.
I'm still working on it.
The honesty of it landed between them with a weight she had not expected. Not heavy in the way of burden, but dense in the way of something real. She felt, rather than saw, the shift in him. The way he turned toward her was not abrupt, but inevitable, the way a river eventually finds the sea. Not rushing, simply moving in the only direction available to it. His hand found hers, not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration or the theater of intention. He simply placed his hand over hers where it rested on the cold stone of the boulder, and his palm was warm, the same impossible warmth she had registered the night he had cupped her face in the snow, and the contact moved through her like the first note of a song that has no name yet, but that the body recognizes anyway. She did not pull away. She looked down at his hand over hers. His hands were large and marked by work, in the way that a man who leads from the front, rather than the rear, accumulates marks, the faint lines of old scars, the particular calluses of a man who trains daily and means it. They were not gentle hands, in the architectural sense. And yet,
You should know, she said very quietly, that I am not practiced at this.
At what?
At being, she paused, searching for the word that was accurate without being more than she intended. At being someone a person chooses to sit beside.
the silence that followed was not empty. He turned his hand beneath hers, a small movement, deliberate, so that their fingers aligned rather than overlapping, and he looked at her profile with an expression she could feel without seeing, the way one feels heat from a source without looking at it directly.
Then we are both learning something this morning.
She looked up at him. He was close, closer than the distance she had maintained when they sat, which meant one of them had closed it without either of them marking the moment it happened. Close enough that the warmth of him was specific now, not ambient, not general, but him, particular and unmistakable. His gray eyes in the dawn light were the color of the sky, just after the blue had left it, that narrow window of color between night and proper day that had no precise name. He lifted his free hand slowly, the deliberateness of it unmistakable, the movement of a man who is making no sudden approaches, who understands that certain things require announcement before they arrive. His fingers found the line of her jaw, not with the urgency of the night in the snowdrift when he had been trying to keep her alive, but with something entirely different. With the unhurried attention of someone who is simply, carefully, learning the shape of something they intend to know well. She stopped breathing for a moment, not from fear, from the complete and involuntary focus of a body that has redirected all available resources toward a single point of sensation. His fingers at her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a lightness that seemed structurally inconsistent with the size and evident history of his hands.
You're still cold.
His voice was barely above a murmur now. She was aware that this was the least of what was currently happening between them, but it was also, somehow, the truest expression of it. The care embedded in the observation, the attention to her physical reality rather than his own.
I am always cold.
Not always.
She understood what he meant. She felt the evidence of it, the warmth that had been building since the moment they sat down, since his hand had covered hers, since the distance between them had done its quiet and unauthorized closing. A warmth that had nothing to do with the dawn or the furs, or the relative protection of the trees behind them. She leaned into his hand. It was small. It was not nothing. She felt him exhale, a long, slow breath that moved through him like something releasing, and his thumb stilled against her cheek and simply rested there, present and warm, and they sat like that for a moment that was both very short and entirely outside the ordinary measure of time, looking at each other in the early light of a northern morning, with the frozen river before them and the abettes behind them, and the camp still sleeping, and the world, for this particular window, requiring nothing of either of them at all. He moved first, not away, but toward. His forehead came to rest against hers with a gentleness so deliberate it arrived like a question, and she answered it by not moving, by staying exactly where she was, by letting the contact exist, forehead to forehead, breath to breath, the cold air between their mouths the only distance remaining. She closed her eyes. There was a word, she thought, in her grandmother's tongue. And then the thought dissolved, because thinking required a part of her mind that was currently otherwise occupied entirely with the warmth of his forehead against hers, and his hand at her jaw, and the sound of his breathing, and the frozen river throwing dawn light at the sky, and this moment, this impossible morning, this thing that had no category in any life she had previously inhabited. He did not kiss her. Not then. The almost of it was its own complete thing. A threshold inhabited rather than crossed, charged with everything that the crossing would eventually mean when it came. She understood this. She thought, in the place below, thought where understanding sometimes lives, that he understood it too, that this was chosen, the staying at the edge of something, the deliberate and mutual decision to let the moment be what it was rather than rush it into the next thing. She opened her eyes. He was watching her, from this impossible closeness, with an expression that she recognized now in the way that one eventually recognizes a piece of music heard many times. The gray eyes, the absolute stillness, the quality of attention that had nothing performative in it. Just him, just this.
Stay.
One word, low and unadorned, and carrying in its single syllable the weight of everything that had not yet been said between them, the weight of the previous evening and the morning, and his hand over hers, and his forehead against hers, and the frozen river, and the cloak in the snow, and the gray eyes in the torchlight, and the word mine spoken at the roadside, like a recognition before either of them had chosen it. She pulled back slightly. Not away, just enough to see him fully, to see the whole of his expression from a distance at which she could process it.
Stay.
Not a question, an echo, a testing of the word in her own mouth, examining its weight, its meaning, what it would require of her, and what it would offer in return.
In the camp, with the column when it moves for the great hall, with me.
She looked at him for a long time. The river light moved across the ice in slow, shifting patterns, and a raven crossed the sky above them in a long, silent arc, and the camp behind the tree line was beginning, faintly, to show the first sounds of waking. A horse, a voice, the distant clang of something metallic in the cook station. She thought about the word away, and what it had meant the morning she had walked north into a snowstorm, with nothing but a wool cloak and a bone comb. Away from a life that had been reducing her, steadily, until there was almost nothing left of her that she recognized as herself. She thought about the word stay, and what it meant now, in this mouth, on this morning, from this man. She thought about the difference between the two.
I do not know how to be in a world where someone chooses me. I have no practice in it. I will likely do it wrong at first.
Then we will figure out the right of it together.
She breathed. The dawn had completed itself now, the sky above the river fully golden, the ice transformed from its blue pre-dawn iridescence into something warmer, the abettes casting long shadows across the bank that stretched toward the water like dark fingers. The cold was still complete and honest and entirely northern, but inside the space that had formed between them on this boulder, at the edge of the frozen Drim, Something was burning that had nothing to apologize to the cold about. She turned her hand over, beneath his. A small and deliberate movement, fingers finding fingers, a rearrangement so minor that someone watching from a distance would not have marked it as significant. She did not say yes with a word. She said it with the turning of her hand, with the staying where she was, with the simple and revolutionary act of not walking away from something that was choosing her. He looked down at their hands, then back at her face, and something in the gray eyes shifted. Something that had been held at careful distance allowed itself in this moment, in this light, on this morning, that had asked nothing of either of them and given them everything in return, to simply be present, unguarded, real. She filed this too, added it to the accumulating archive of things she was not yet ready to name, but that she was keeping with the same care she gave her grandmother's comb, as something irreplaceable, something that belonged only to her, something that the world could not take back once it had been given. They sat there until the camp woke fully, and the sounds of it grew too present to ignore. The shouts of the morning watch change, the horses being let out for watering, Henrik Berg's voice carrying across the tree line with a volume that suggested he had opinions about something and was not interested in having them quietly. And even then, even as the morning reasserted its demands on them both, neither moved with haste. They rose from the boulder with the unhurried quality of people who have made a decision and feel no need to rush the moment that follows it. He walked close to her on the way back through the trees, not touching, but close enough that the warmth of him was continuous, a presence she could map without looking. She kept her hands in the cloak and her eyes on the path, and her mind very carefully not too far ahead of her feet, because ahead was a great hall and a kingdom and a world full of people for whom an Omega, standing beside the Alpha King, was a problem of several different varieties, and she was not yet ready to walk into all of that. But she was, she realized. As the tree line ended and the camp opened before them in its full morning activity, she was walking toward it, not away, toward. It was, she thought, a remarkable difference. What she did not know, what neither of them knew, in the warmth of that morning and the quiet of what had been spoken and held and almost crossed by the river, was that someone had been watching the tree line from the far edge of the camp since before dawn. A rider, dark cloak, no clan markings visible, the kind of deliberate anonymity that was in itself a kind of declaration. He turned his horse and rode south before the camp had fully registered his presence, and the message he carried was already halfway composed in his mind, the kind of message that, once delivered, has consequences that a frozen river and a boulder and a morning of true things cannot protect against. The great fort of Drimtorn rose from the northern rock like something the mountain had grown rather than something men had built upon it. Gray stone and timber blackened by decades of northern winters, towers that did not reach for the sky so much as occupy it, walls thick enough that the cold outside registered inside only as a distant rumor. The column had arrived at midday, through gates wide enough to swallow the entire war party without compression, and the fort had received them with the organized efficiency of a place accustomed to the return of its king and the controlled chaos that accompanied him. Vandrima had ridden in on a horse she had not been asked to manage herself, which she had managed anyway, because the alternative was being led like cargo, and she had established early in her life that she was not cargo. She had ridden near the middle of the column, not hidden, not displayed, simply present, and had watched the fort materialize from the winter landscape with the particular attention of someone cataloging a new environment for the practical information it contained rather than the aesthetic. She had noted the thickness of the walls, the placement of the watch stations, the organization of the interior yard, the number of people who appeared immediately upon the column's arrival, and the speed with which they moved, which told her something about how the fort was run, and therefore something about the man who ran it. She had noted the way the fort's inhabitants looked at the column and the king at its head, Not the performance of welcome required by rank, but something more genuine, more specific. The kind of look that people give a leader they would follow, because they choose to, rather than because they must. She had noted, with somewhat less analytical remove, the moment Marcus had glanced back along the column to find her. Just once. Brief, a confirmation rather than a check. And the way the knot of tension she had been carrying since the tree line outside the camp had loosened slightly. At the contact. She had noted this and filed it. The first 2 days in the fort passed in a kind of provisional peace that she treated with the cautious appreciation of someone who understands that provisional is not the same as permanent. She was given a chamber, not a servant's room beside the hearth, not a pallet in a corridor, but a chamber with a proper door and a window that looked out over the inner yard, and a hearth that someone lit before she arrived and maintained without being asked. The luxury of it was so entirely outside her previous range of experience that she spent the first night sitting on the edge of the bed, simply taking inventory of it, the way one takes inventory of a room that is difficult to believe is real. She saw Marcus at meals, in the great hall, which was not the temporary banquet tent of the camp, but the permanent, high-ceilinged, fire-scented reality of a hall that had hosted centuries of northern life, births and deaths and oaths and grief, and the ordinary and extraordinary accumulation of days lived in a cold, difficult, beautiful place. He sat at the head of the long table as he had sat at the head of the campaign table, with the same unhurried authority. And she sat several places down because the geography of the Great Hall was a social document she was still learning to read, and she was not going to make claims on proximity she hadn't yet understood the cost of. But his eyes found her. Across the length of the table, across the noise and the firelight, and the organized complexity of a full court at dinner, his eyes found her with the reliability of something that had been calibrated to a specific frequency. And when they did, everything else, the hall, the noise, the firelight, the accumulated weight of all the watching that a woman in her position in this place attracted, receded into a manageable background. This was new. This had never happened before. She had spent 24 years being invisible, and now she was the opposite, and the opposite was loud in ways she was still adjusting to, but the gray eyes across the hall were not loud. They were, if anything, the quietest thing in the room, and quiet, in her experience, was where the true things lived. On the third morning, Marcus came to her chamber door before breakfast. She heard the knock and knew it was him before she opened the door, the same involuntary recognition she had catalogued since the first night in the tent, her senses having apparently made a unilateral decision to map him specifically, without consulting her preferences on the matter. She opened the door, and he was there in the corridor, dressed for the day in dark wool and the leather pauldrons he wore as a default concession to the court's expectation of visible authority, his golden hair pulled back from his face in a way that made the angles of it more apparent. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been awake for some time and had spent part of that time deciding how to say something.
I need to speak with you before the morning session.
She stepped back to let him in. He entered and stood near the window, not sitting, which told her the conversation required a certain readiness, and looked out at the inner yard for a moment before turning to face her.
I called the council last night after you had retired.
What council?
The Elder Council. The 7 who hold the ceremonial authority of the clans under the king's rule. I informed them of my intention.
She waited. She was very good at waiting. It was, perhaps, the skill she had developed to the highest degree over 24 years of existing in spaces where information was controlled by others, the ability to hold space and silence without filling it with anxiety, without reaching for the conclusion before it arrived.
I intend to claim you as my mate.
The words landed with the complete and total absence of drama he had apparently decided they deserved. Stated plainly, in the tone of a man who has made a decision and sees no productive purpose in obscuring it with elaborate framing. She looked at him. He looked back at her. She had known this was coming. She had known it in the way one knows things that have not yet been said, but have been present in every exchange, every glance, every morning by the river, the knowledge accumulating silently until the moment of articulation was less revelation than confirmation. And yet, hearing it in plain language, in the gray morning light of a room she was still getting used to being allowed to occupy, was its own specific thing.
The council agreed?
The council was informed. Their agreement is a matter of protocol, not permission.
There's a difference?
When it comes to this, yes.
She turned to the window, because she needed a moment to organize herself that was not visible to him, and the yard below was impersonal and safe to look at.
What does the protocol require?
A ritual. Before the assembled elders and the clan representatives currently in residence, you would be presented formally, and they would have the opportunity to speak.
To object.
To speak. What they choose to say is their business.
And if what they choose to say is that an Omega cannot be mate to an Alpha King?
She said it without heat. A genuine question, not a challenge. The thing she needed to know in order to assess what she was being asked to walk into. He crossed the room. Not quickly. He did nothing quickly, she was learning. That was not a physical emergency. But with the directness of a man who had decided that distance was not the appropriate response to this particular moment. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing in it she could interpret as uncertainty.
Then they will have said it, and I will have heard it, and my decision will remain what it is.
She held his gaze. He held hers. The morning light between them was the pale, clear light of a northern winter that had nothing to prove, and it illuminated his face without mercy and without flattery. And what she saw in it was what she had been accumulating for days now. The steadiness of it, the complete absence of performance, the quality of a man who was not telling her what she wanted to hear because he had calculated that it would serve him, but because it was the thing that was true. She raised her hand and placed it flat against his chest, slowly, deliberately, the way she had turned her hand on the boulder by the river. A small gesture with a great deal in it. Beneath her palm, she felt the steady, unhurried beat of his heart and the warmth of him through the wool, and the absolute solidity of him. And for a moment, that was several things at once. She simply stood there with her hand against his chest and let herself be in this room, in this morning, in this life that had not, even 12 days ago, contained anything that resembled the possibility of this.
I will need something to wear that isn't this.
He looked down at her hand on his chest, then back at her face, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had catalogued from the campaign banquet, the suggestion of an expression rather than the full performance of one, as though full expressions were a luxury. He rationed carefully, and this one had been approved.
I will arrange it.
And I will need to know what they are likely to say. All of it. Not the version softened for my benefit.
You'll have it.
And if I decide after hearing all of it that this is not?
Then that is your decision to make.
She looked at him for a long moment.
You would accept that?
I would not like it, he said. And the plainness of it, the sheer, uncomplicated honesty of it was almost more than she knew what to do with. But you are not a thing I have acquired. You are a person I am asking.
She removed her hand from his chest. Not in withdrawal, in completion, the way one completes a sentence. She looked at the window, at the yard, at the cold, clear morning that was waiting outside for all of this to be resolved.
Tell me what they are likely to say,
he told her. He sat in the chair by the hearth while she stood at the window, and he gave her the unsoftened version as she had asked. The political dimensions first, because these were the ones with the most predictable structure. The anxiety of the clan representatives about precedent, about what an Omega Queen meant for the bloodline expectations that governed alliance marriages, about the deals that had been made in assumption of a particular future for the king's mate bond that would now require renegotiation. These were manageable problems, he said, in the tone of a man for whom renegotiation was simply another form of combat, and therefore not particularly alarming. Then the Elder Council's likely positions. 3 of the 7 were formalists, meaning their objection would be grounded in ceremonial law and its interpretation, and their arguments would be structured and citable, and therefore answerable in their own language. 2 were pragmatists who would follow the weight of evidence. 1, Elder Oscar Larson, eldest of the council, who had held his position since before Marcus had been born and maintained it with the specific tenacity of a man who had confused endurance with wisdom, would object on principle, loudly, with the authority of someone who understood that his disapproval carried symbolic weight even when it carried no actual veto. And then, the last thing, which he told her with a stillness that indicated he had been deciding whether to include it.
There may be questions about your past, about your clan, about the circumstances under which you came to be on the road.
You mean someone will say my family abandoned me to die in the snow and ask what that reflects about my worth?
Someone will try to use it as evidence of diminished value, yes.
She absorbed this with the particular expression she had spent years perfecting, the one that looked like calm and was actually something deeper and more defended. He watched her absorb it and said nothing, which she noted.
All right.
All right.
I said I wanted the unsoftened version. That is the unsoftened version. I prefer to walk into rooms knowing what they contain.
He looked at her for a long moment.
You are, he said very quietly, not what I expected.
What did you expect?
I'm not certain, not this.
She said nothing. The fire between them burned with the comfortable indifference of something that had no stake in the conversation and was simply doing its job. The ritual was called for the following afternoon. The Hall of the Sacred Flames was the oldest room in the fort. Older than the current walls, older than the current family name attached to those walls. A room built to outlast the specific people who used it and to remind them, regularly, that they were specific people in a long line of specific people, each of whom had stood in this room and felt the same thing, the particular, instructive smallness of standing in a place that predates you and will survive you. The flames that gave the hall its name were not torches, but a series of stone basins set into the floor in a pattern whose geometry had been established before the memory of anyone currently living, burning with the heavy, resinous oil that the hall's attendants replenished according to a schedule kept in a document older than the king's grandfather. Vandrima stood at the entrance of the hall and looked into it, and did what she had always done when entering rooms that required things of her. She breathed, she assessed, and she walked in as though she had always been entitled to be there, because the alternative was to walk in as though she hadn't. And she had made her decision about that a long time ago. She was wearing dark blue. The clothing Marcus had arranged, true to his word, delivered to her chamber by Mira Larson with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been given a task and was not interested in editorializing about it, was a dress of deep, midnight wool with a belt of silver-worked leather and a cloak that she had left off because the hall was warm, and also because she had decided, after careful consideration, that she was not going to walk into this ritual armored in borrowed warmth. Her braids were dressed and pinned, copper beads threaded through them from a small supply that Mira had produced from somewhere, with an expression of total, professional neutrality. Her grandmother's copper beads, not the same beads, but the same idea, reclaimed. The hall was arranged with the specific formality of a space that has been organized for ritual purpose. The 7 elder council members seated on the curved bench that ran the far wall, clan representatives standing in the spaces between the flame basins, Marcus at the center of the room with the stillness of a man who has chosen his position and does not intend to move from it. He wore no crown. Crowns were for public ceremony, And this was not public in the way of spectacle, but it was public in the way of witness, which was more honest. He wore the dark wool and the silver clasp at his shoulder that indicated the highest rank, and his golden hair was unbound. And when Vandrima entered, he turned to look at her with an expression that no one in the room could have interpreted as anything other than exactly what it was. She walked to the center of the hall. The elder council examined her. This was not metaphorical. Ylva Ekman's yellow-toothed successor, a man named Oscar Larson, old and deliberate and clearly accustomed to the weight his displeasure carried in a room, looked at her with the comprehensive assessment of someone appraising livestock, and she looked back at him with the expression that looked like calm, and the silence between them lasted precisely as long as she required it to in order to establish that she was not going to flinch. The proceedings began. The formalist spoke first, as Marcus had predicted. Structured, citable, grounded in the language of ceremonial law. Mads Erikson, the eldest of the three, laid out the argument with the rhythmic precision of a man who had been making this argument in his head since the moment the council had been convened and was now simply releasing it into the room. An Omega mate bond for the Alpha King was without precedent in the recorded history of the northern clans. Precedent existed for a reason. Precedent was the accumulated wisdom of those who had come before, tested by time, proven by survival. To set aside precedent was to set aside the wisdom of the dead in favor of the impulse of the living, which was, historically, how disasters began. The pragmatists noted several counter-precedents that Mads had elected to omit from his account. The formalists noted that those counter-precedents were of a different categorical nature and therefore not applicable. The pragmatists noted that the definition of categorical nature was itself a matter of interpretation. The formalists declined to accept this. The hall had the particular energy of men who had been having this specific argument for many years and had developed a comfortable fluency in it that did not require them to update their positions in response to new information. Vandrima stood in the center of it all and said nothing, because she had not been invited to speak yet, and she had learned early that speaking without invitation in rooms full of people who had decided your value was often less effective than waiting until the room was ready to hear you. Then Oscar Larson spoke. He did not speak loudly. He had the particular authority of a man who had learned that volume was the tool of people who were not certain they were being listened to, and he was always certain he was being listened to. He looked at Vandrima, and he spoke about the Omega classification in the language of biology and bloodline, the old language, the language that reduced things to function and hierarchy, and the mechanical requirements of a world that needed certain people to be certain things in order to maintain the structure that everyone in this room benefited from. He spoke about the king's legacy and the expectations of the clans and the significance of the mate bond as a political instrument and the incompatibility of that instrument with an Omega whose own family had. He said the words, clearly and with full intention. He said that Vandrima Noxus had been left on the road by the family that knew her best and that this fact, whatever its cause, was information. That a woman abandoned by her own blood carried that abandonment into every alliance she formed thereafter. That the question of what the Alpha King chose to take to his hearth and his bed was also the question of what the northern clans chose to stake their future on, and he, Oscar Larson, would not be silent on the matter. The hall was quiet after he finished, not the comfortable quiet of consensus. The hard, specific quiet of a room in which something has been said that everyone was thinking and no one else had quite committed to saying. And now it was out, and whatever happened next would happen in a space where it existed. Vandrima stood in the center of the hall. She looked at Oscar Larson. She let the quiet be quiet for a moment, because the moment deserved it. Because she had spent 24 years with some version of that speech at her back, in various registers and volumes, and it warranted the acknowledgement of being heard before she answered it. Then she spoke.
You are correct that my family left me on the road. That is an accurate fact. I will not contest it or soften it or offer you an explanation that makes it more comfortable, because comfortable is not what happened.
She paused, looked at the council, at the clan representatives, then back at Oscar Larson.
What I will offer you is this. I walked out of a life that had been reducing me for 24 years with a wool cloak, a knife, and a bone comb that belonged to my grandmother. I walked north into a storm because the alternative was to remain in a place that had decided I was worth nothing and to slowly become nothing in accordance with that decision. And I did not make it to wherever I was going, but I was walking. You may interpret my family's abandonment as evidence of my diminished value. I interpret it as evidence that they were afraid of what I might become if I was ever given the space to become it.
The hall was still.
I am an Omega. I will not pretend otherwise. And I would not if I could, because I am also every other thing I have made myself in the absence of anyone making it easier. And those things are not separate from my rank. They are what I built in the space my rank provided. You are asking whether I am adequate to stand beside your king. I am asking whether this council is adequate to judge the answer to that question, and I am suggesting, with respect, that the answer to mine is more uncertain than the answer to yours.
Mats Eriksson blinked. One of the pragmatists made a sound that was not quite a cough. Oscar Larson looked at her for a long, unreadable moment with the expression of a man who had not, in considerable years of council service, been spoken to in this particular register from the center of a ritual floor, and was currently running the calculation of whether he was offended or impressed, and finding the result less certain than he would prefer. And then, from the center of the hall, from the position he had held without moving since she had entered it, Marcus spoke.
The council has heard the objections. The council has heard the woman who stands before them. I will now speak as Alpha King, and I will speak once because once is sufficient.
He turned to face the council. He had not moved from his position throughout the entire proceeding, had stood without intervention while Oscar Larson said the words without visible reaction, with the absolute and deliberate stillness of a man who had made a decision and was content to let the room reach it on its own schedule. Now he moved, a single step forward, small, and somehow the most significant movement that had occurred in the hall.
I have led this territory for 13 years. In that time I have taken counsel from this body on matters of law and ceremony and the management of traditions that require managing. That counsel has been in the main worth having. But the mate bond is not a council matter. It has never been a council matter. It is the oldest and most fundamental right of every alpha in the northern bloodlines, irrespective of rank, the right to recognize what the bond recognizes and to honor it. I am exercising that right. The ritual is not a trial, it is a presentation, and the presentation is complete.
He turned from the council to Vandrima. And then he crossed the room. He crossed it with the same unhurried directness that had moved him through the snow toward her at the roadside, the walk of a man who has made a decision and is simply closing the distance between that decision and its expression. He stopped in front of her in the center of the Sacred Flames Hall, with the 7 Elder Council watching and the clan representatives watching, and the ancient basins burning their heavy resinous oil and the walls holding their centuries of quiet witness. He looked at her, just for a moment. One look, direct and complete, that contained everything it needed to contain. Then he took her hand. Both hands, his closing around hers with the warmth that had become, in fewer days than she could properly account for, something her body recognized as a specific and irreplaceable thing.
You spoke very well.
I had 24 years of material to draw from.
The suggestion of an expression again. More than suggestion this time, something that reached his eyes and stayed there. He raised her hands, both of them, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Not quickly, with the deliberateness that characterized everything he did, a deliberateness that, she had come to understand, was not slowness, but intention, the complete application of attention to a single point. She felt it move through her from her knuckles to every other part of her simultaneously. This was not an exaggeration. She was a precise and empirical observer of her own experience, and what she observed was that the contact moved through her the way warmth moves into cold stone, total and without preference for any particular direction. Behind them, the council was silent. In the silence, she heard Mads Erikson murmur something to the man beside him. She heard a rustle of cloaks, the small sounds of people recalibrating their positions in the face of something that had just made their positions considerably less relevant. She heard Oscar Larson exhale, a long, slow breath, the exhalation of a man who has decided, with whatever private mixture of feelings the decision involved, that a battle is over. She heard none of it very clearly, because Marcus Drimtorn was still holding her hands, and the warmth of his grip was a very effective argument for prioritizing it.
Was that for them or for me?
She kept her voice low. His eyes moved to hers, and in them was the expression she recognized now, fully, completely, without any remaining ambiguity.
You.
She held his gaze.
Good.
The ritual concluded with the formal words spoken by the eldest pragmatist, not Oscar Larson, who had apparently decided that his contribution to the proceedings was complete, but a woman named Nora Björk, the youngest of the seven and the only woman among them, who spoke the language of acknowledgement with the clean efficiency of someone who was very pleased to be saying it and had been waiting for the opportunity. The mate bond was formally witnessed. The record was formally noted. The Hall of Sacred Flames had, as it had done for centuries, absorbed another moment into its walls and made it permanent. Vandrima walked out of that hall beside Marcus Drimtorn, not behind him, not ahead of him, but beside him, and the clan representatives made way with the particular combination of deference and curiosity of people who have just had their understanding of a situation substantially revised. The fort corridor outside the hall was cold after the warmth of the flames. She felt the temperature change and breathed it in. Clean, specific, northern cold, the kind that had tried to kill her less than a week ago, and now simply felt like weather. He slowed as they turned the first corridor, and the hall entrance moved out of sight behind them, slowed and turned slightly toward her, the motion opening a space between his pace and the world's that was, she recognized, an invitation. She stopped. He stopped. In the corridor, in the cold, in the ordinary stone light of a fort that was still going about its day around them, he looked at her with an expression that had, in the absence of any audience, let down whatever last guard the hall had required him to maintain. She looked back. His hand came up, the same slow, announced movement she had first felt by the frozen river, and found her face, his thumb at her cheekbone, his palm warm against her jaw. And she leaned into it, the way she had leaned into it then, because some responses, once established, stop requiring deliberation.
It begins now. Whatever comes next.
I know.
There will be more rooms like that one.
I know that too.
And you are still here.
She reached up and placed her hand over his, where it rested against her face, her fingers over his knuckles, mirroring the gesture he had made in the hall in reverse, a small and deliberate and entirely complete thing.
I told you, I'm learning how to stay.
His forehead came to hers. The same threshold as the river, the same warmth, the same quality of almost that was itself, a wholeness. She closed her eyes. In the fort above them, in the council hall they had left behind, Oscar Larson sat for a long time after everyone else had filed out, in front of the ancient flames, with an expression no one was present to read. And in the war room on the opposite wing of the fort, a sealed message had arrived an hour earlier from the southern road, unsigned, unclaimed, bearing no clan mark but smelling unmistakably of pine resin and the particular ink that the Noxus clan scribe had been using for 30 years. It sat on the campaign table unopened. Its contents, had anyone read them, would have ended the warmth of this corridor considerably sooner than either of them deserved. The sealed letter had been sitting on the campaign table for 2 days before Marcus opened it. Not because he had forgotten it. He was not a man who forgot things that were placed in front of him. He was, in fact, the kind of man who catalogued everything in his peripheral field with the automatic precision of someone who had learned early that the things left unread were often the things that decided outcomes. He had not opened it because he had known, with the particular instinct of a man who had been reading political weather for 13 years, what it contained. And he had wanted, with a selfishness he did not apologize for, 2 more days of the fort feeling the way it had felt since the Hall of the Sacred Flames, like a place where something good had taken root and was being given room to grow. He opened it on the 3rd morning. He read it standing at the campaign table in the gray before dawn light, and when he finished, he set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who is managing their first response before committing to their second. Then he read it again, because precision mattered, and he was not in the habit of reacting to his first reading of anything. The letter was from the Noxus clan elder, not Eric Johansson, Vandrima's father, but Leif, her brother, which told Marcus something about the internal dynamics of a family that he had already formed opinions about. Leif Anderson Noxus, speaking on behalf of an emergency coalition of 4 clans, announced that the situation regarding the Omega Vandrima Noxus had been brought to the attention of the allied families, that her status as the king's claimed mate was being contested on grounds of precedent and clan right, and that a formal dispute hearing was being demanded under the old laws, the laws that predated the current kingship and retained their authority in matters of mate bond legitimacy. A coalition of 4 clans, under the old laws, had the standing to convene a hearing in the king's own hall. They were already on the road. Marcus stood at the campaign table for a long time after finishing the letter the 2nd time. Outside the fort, the northern dark was beginning its slow concession to dawn, the first paleness at the edge of the sky, barely a suggestion, the way all the most significant things began. He thought about the Hall of Sacred Flames and the way Vandrima had stood in its center and spoken to Oscar Larson with the precise, measured confidence of someone who had spent 24 years finding the words for a speech she had never expected to be given an audience for. He folded the letter, put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, where he kept the things that required action. Then he went to find her. She was awake. Of course she was awake. She was, he had learned, constitutionally incapable of sleeping past the first light, a habit formed in years of being required before dawn and maintained now, apparently by architecture. She was at her window when he knocked, the gray morning behind her and her braids unbound for the first time he had seen, the red of them loose around her shoulders, like something wild that had been given permission to exist without management. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. He was not certain she knew what she looked like in the unguarded early morning, the window light and the loose hair and the particular quality of her face when it was not organizing itself for a room full of people. He thought that possibly no one had ever told her, and that this was a failing of her previous world that he intended to address comprehensively. She looked at his face and read it immediately. She was very good at reading faces. Another skill formed in circumstance, the ability to assess mood and intent from minimal information, because minimal information had always been what was offered to her.
What has happened?
He entered and closed the door and told her. He gave her the full version, the coalition, the old law provision, the approximate timing of their arrival, what the hearing would look like, and what it would require, and what the range of outcomes contained. He told it the way he told her everything, without softening, because she had asked him once for the unsoftened version and had not given him any reason since to revise that approach. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she turned back to the window and looked out at the yard below, where the first of the morning's activity was beginning, a groom crossing with water buckets, a watchman at the far wall completing his circuit, the ordinary and continuous life of a fort that did not know yet what was coming.
My brother.
Not a question, not surprise. Just the word, his name embedded in his title, spoken with the quality of someone completing a sentence they had known was coming.
He was always better at managing situations than addressing them.
He has 4 clans behind him.
He always needed other people behind him.
She turned from the window. Her unbound hair moved around her shoulders as she turned, and he watched it with the particular attention he had begun to pay to specific details of her. The copper beads she now wore always, the precise line of her jaw when she was thinking, the way her hands went still when she was organizing something complex. She looked at him with the expression that looked like calm and was, he now knew, several other things operating beneath the surface of it.
What do you need from me?
He crossed the room. Crossed it the way he always crossed space toward her now. Without haste, without performance, with the simple directness of someone for whom the destination was not a decision, but a given. He stopped in front of her and raised his hand to her face. The touch that had become, in the short, impossible span of days, the most natural thing he did. His palm warm against her jaw, his thumb finding the line of her cheekbone.
Nothing you haven't already given.
That's not an answer.
I need you to stand in a room full of people who are going to try to make you small. And to remember that the only person in that room whose opinion of your size I am interested in is yours.
She looked up at him. He looked down at her. Between them, the morning was arriving properly now, the window behind her going from gray to the first pale gold, touching her hair and turning the red of it into something that had no adequate color word in any northern tongue he knew. He thought, not for the first time, that he had no adequate words for her specifically. He had spent 13 years being the most articulate man in any room he occupied, and she routinely left him with the particular sensation of having run out of language and found it less distressing than expected.
And your opinion of my size?
I have never met anyone larger.
She held his gaze for a moment. Then she raised herself, a small, deliberate motion, onto the balls of her feet, and pressed her lips to the line of his jaw. Not his mouth. The jaw, the place where the bone was most apparent, the architecture of him most visible. A choice, he understood. A precision. He went very still. She lowered back onto her heels and looked at him with the expression that occasionally surfaced when she had done something that surprised herself as much as anyone. A flicker of something that was not quite self-consciousness and not quite satisfaction, but contained elements of both.
Then we should not keep 4 clans waiting.
He exhaled. One long, controlled breath. The corner of his mouth moved.
No, we should not.
They arrived 3 hours later. The coalition entered through the fort's main gates with the organized formality of people who were aware they were making an entrance and had prepared accordingly. 4 clan banners, a delegation of perhaps 30, Eric Johansson Noxus among them, with the posture of a man who has borrowed confidence from the numbers around him and is hoping the loan holds. Leif Anderson Noxus at the front, which told Marcus everything about the family's current internal hierarchy that he needed to know. Marcus received them in the Great Hall. The Great Hall of Drimtorn Fort was the kind of room that had a position on things. Its age and its proportions and the quality of light that moved through its high windows had an effect on people that was distinct from the effect of the king sitting at its end in the great chair, though the combination of the two was, he was aware, not an accident of architecture. The hall said, "Things of consequence have happened here. Things of consequence will continue to happen here. The question of what role you are playing in those things is currently being assessed." The coalition filed in and arranged themselves on one side of the central aisle with the organized aggression of people who had rehearsed this on the road. Marcus sat in the great chair and watched them arrange themselves. He had dressed with the deliberateness of someone who understood clothing as communication. The dark wool and the silver clasp, but also the fur at his shoulders that indicated formal function. The sword at his hip that indicated he had not left it somewhere else for the sake of the room's comfort. His golden hair was unbound because he had stopped binding it the morning by the river and had not resumed the practice, and if anyone in the room had thoughts about this, they kept them to themselves. Beside him, not behind him, not at a distance, arranged for the optics of a court unused to an omega at the king's right hand, but beside him, one step down from the great chair in the place that had been set for her with the specific intentionality of a man who had thought carefully about the geometry of this moment, was Vandrima. She had dressed in the deep midnight blue again, the copper beads. Her braids dressed with the precision of someone who understood that precision was its own statement. She sat with the stillness of a woman who had spent 24 years learning how to occupy space without disturbing it, and had recently made the decision to revise that practice. And the stillness now was not the old stillness of someone trying to disappear, but something different. The stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere and is entirely, deliberately present in it. Life Anderson Noxus looked at her from across the hall. She looked back. The look between them lasted no longer than 3 seconds and contained the entire history of their family in compressed and accurate form. He looked away first. The hearing proceeded with the formal language of the old laws, invocations and procedural declarations delivered by the clan elder they had brought for the purpose, an ancient man named Sven Nygard, who had a voice like gravel, and the particular energy of someone who had been practicing this speech for the journey and was now delivering it with professional satisfaction. The coalition's argument was structured around 3 points: the precedent of Omega mate bonds for sitting kings, the standing of the Noxus clan as Vandrima's blood family to contest the bond, and the question of whether the claiming in the Hall of Sacred Flames had followed proper protocol given the irregular circumstances of her arrival at the fort. Marcus's counsel, a compact and sharp-eyed man named Victor Lindstrom, who had served the king for 9 years and had the particular gift of making devastating legal arguments sound like casual observations, addressed the first and third points with the methodical efficiency of someone demolishing a structure he had built himself, because he knew every weakness in it. The precedent argument was addressed in detail. The protocol argument was addressed in less detail because it required less. The second point, the family standing, was where it became complicated because the old laws were old for a reason, and their provisions on this specific question were not without ambiguity. The room was managing itself, the specific tension of a formal dispute in a space that takes formality seriously, when Eric Johansson Noxus spoke for the first time. He had not spoken yet. He had stood among the delegation with the posture of a man who knows his position in the proceeding and has been waiting for it. When Sven Nygard gave him the floor, he stepped forward, and he looked at Vandrima. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at the council or at Victor Lindstrom or at the room in its formal arrangement. He looked at his daughter, and his expression was the expression of a man who has spent significant time constructing a version of a story in which he is not the architect of an injustice and has partially succeeded in believing it. He spoke about the Omega status and the burden it had represented for the family. He spoke about the decisions they had made as decisions born of necessity rather than malice. He spoke about the road in a way that made it sound, if not justified, then at least comprehensible. The kind of thing that happened in difficult times, that people with limited options sometimes did, that should not be held against those who had done it because they had been operating within constraints that the King's Court, with its resources and its insulation from the ordinary difficulties of clan life, might not fully appreciate. He spoke about his daughter as though she were a subject of discussion rather than a person in the room. He had been speaking for perhaps 4 minutes when Vandrima stood. She did not ask for the floor. She did not wait for Sven Nygard to recognize her, or for Victor Lindstrom to object on procedural grounds, or for Marcus to intervene, though she felt, rather than saw the movement he made when she rose, the slight forward shift in the great chair, the readiness of a man who was giving her the room to do this herself, but was present behind her in the way that mattered most. She stood, and the hall went quiet, with the specific quality of a room that has just registered something unexpected. She looked at her father.
You have spoken about me for 4 minutes and have not looked at me directly once. I would like you to look at me.
The hall was so quiet that the fire in the nearest brazier was audible. Eric Johansson Noxus looked at her. His face did something complicated that she did not spend time analyzing, because she was not here to analyze his feelings. She was here to say something true in a room full of people who needed to hear it, and she had been carrying it for a long time. And this was, improbably and completely, the right room.
You left me on the road in a storm. I know why you did it. I knew why at the time, not because I was told, but because I'd spent 17 years watching you look at me the way you are looking at me now, which is the way a person looks at something that disappoints them by existing, and I had become very accurate at reading the conclusions you were drawing. You decided that what I was made me worth less than the difficulty of keeping me. That is a thing a person can decide. People make that decision. I am not here to tell you that you are a monster for making it, because I have spent 24 years learning that the people who diminish us are not usually monsters. They are usually just frightened and small and incapable of imagining that the thing they have decided is worthless might be worth more than they can currently perceive.
She paused. She looked at the room, at the coalition, at the clan representatives, at the council, at the faces of people who had come here with a position and were currently having the experience of that position becoming less certain.
I am an Omega. I will say this clearly once for the record of this hall, because I understand that for many people in this room, it is the thing that is supposed to end the conversation. I am an Omega, and I was left to die in the snow by the family that was supposed to be my blood, and I walked out of a life that had decided I was nothing, with a wool cloak and a knife, and a comb that had belonged to the only person who had ever seen me clearly. And I am standing in this hall beside the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, and I am telling you, looking at all of you, that none of the things you have decided about what an Omega is or is worth or is capable of bearing are things you decided based on evidence. You decided them because the structure required it, because the structure needed certain people to be small so that other people's size could be confirmed by comparison.
The silence was total.
I am not interested in being small for the structure's convenience, and I am not a subject of this dispute. I am a person who made a choice in a corridor 5 days ago to stay in a place that asked me to stay, and that choice belongs to me in a way that this coalition, under any law old or new, does not have the standing to contest, because you cannot claim ownership over something you threw away.
She looked at her father one last time.
I do not hate you, she said, and it was quiet and entirely true. I think you did the worst thing you have done in your life and have not yet understood that it was the worst thing. I think you may eventually. I hope you do, not for my sake, but because the alternative is a long time to live with something that heavy and no honest name for it.
She sat. The room breathed. It breathed the way a room breathes after something has shifted its weight irrevocably. Not the held breath of shock, but the released breath of a space that has absorbed something permanent and is making room for it. The clan representatives along the walls exchanged looks that contained too much to be easily categorized. Sven Nygard appeared to have temporarily forgotten that he was running a proceeding. The pragmatist council members looked at each other with the expression of people watching something they will describe for years. Even Oscar Larson, who had attended as an observer with the specific energy of someone prepared to be vindicated, was sitting very still, with an expression that was doing something she had not previously seen an elder's face do. Leif Anderson Noxus stared at his sister from across the hall. She did not look at him. She looked straight forward, at the far wall, at the ancient timber and the banners and the accumulated evidence of a place that had been standing for longer than any of the arguments in this room had existed. Then Marcus stood. He stood from the great chair with the unhurried completeness of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment, not with impatience, not with urgency, but with the certainty of a man who knows when his moment is and has no interest in anticipating it or delaying it. He descended the 2 steps from the chair's platform and came to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not between her and the room, but beside her, his shoulder at her shoulder, his presence not replacing what she had just done, but completing the frame of it. He looked at the coalition.
The hearing is concluded.
Victor Lindstrom, who had been a king's counsel for 9 years and had developed an accurate sense of when elaboration added value and when it did not, remained entirely silent.
The old laws provide for the coalition's right to convene this hearing. They do not provide for the coalition's right to override the mate bond recognition of a sitting king. And they do not provide for the family standing of a clan to contest a bond when that family's last documented act toward the person in question was abandonment under lethal conditions. Victor has the relevant citations if anyone would like them. I suspect no one would like them.
No one indicated that they would like them?
The woman beside me is Vandrima Noxus. She is my claimed mate, witnessed under the old forms in the Hall of Sacred Flames in the presence of the full Elder Council. She is, under the law that this coalition invoked to convene this hearing, therefore entitled to every protection and standing that my house and my kingship provide. I will not be elaborating on what I think of the coalition's decision to make this journey, because I was raised not to elaborate on things that do not require it.
He turned to Eric Johansson Noxus. The look between them was brief and total and contained no ambiguity of any variety.
You may use my fort's hospitality tonight if the road requires it. You will leave in the morning.
He turned back, and he looked at Vandrima. She looked up at him. His gray eyes in the hall's firelight were the same color they had been the night he had found her in the snow, certain and specific, and directed at her with the quality she had been cataloging since that moment, the quality of recognition, of something that had been looking for a long time and had found what it was looking for, and was not, under any circumstances, going to let the finding go. She felt his hand find hers at her side, fingers threading between hers, warm and deliberate, and completely unconcerned with who in the room was watching. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She said nothing. She didn't need to either. Around them, the great hall of Drimtorn resumed its organized existence. The proceeding formally closed, the coalition beginning its reconfiguration from an entity with a declared purpose to a group of people who had to figure out what they were now that the purpose had been declined, the King's Council making their efficient way toward the administrative aftermath of the morning. The fire in the braziers burned with the same comfortable indifference it always brought to the proceedings of the people around it. Vandrima stood in the hall beside Marcus Drimtorn and felt, for the first time in her life, the particular sensation of taking up exactly the space she was supposed to take up. Not more than she had previously allowed herself. Not less than the room could accommodate. Exactly the space. The right amount. Hers. They left the hall together. The fort's corridor was cold after the fire of the great room, and the afternoon had committed itself while the hearing was in progress. The light through the slit windows gone from morning pale to the richer gold of the day's later hours. They walked without a particular destination for a moment, simply the relief of motion after the held stillness of the hall, and she was aware of his hand still in hers as they walked, the warmth of it continuous and unhurried.
I didn't plan what I was going to say.
I know.
I might have said too much.
No.
The part about the structure?
Was accurate.
It might have been more than the moment required.
Vandrima.
She stopped. He stopped beside her.
You have spent 24 years saying less than the moment required. I do not think today's accounting is in deficit.
She looked at him. She wanted to say something precise and adequate, and she did not have it. The words were not where she usually kept them, and she was becoming accustomed to the fact that this happened to her, specifically, in proximity to him, specifically, and she was choosing to interpret this as evidence of significance rather than failure. She stepped forward instead. One step, deliberate, closing the remaining distance between them in the corridor, and she raised her face to his and looked at him from the distance at which there was nothing left to misread. He saw it with the immediacy of someone whose attention had been entirely, for months without knowing it, and days with full knowledge, calibrated to her specifically. His free hand came to her face, the touch that was now as familiar as breathing, warm and certain and absolutely particular to her, and he looked at her for one long, still, complete moment. And then, in the corridor of his fort in the afternoon light, with the coalition receding behind them and the old laws satisfied, and the hall of sacred flames having done its ancient work, Marcus Drimtorn kissed her. It was not the almost of the river morning. It was not the threshold inhabited, but not crossed. It was the crossing, fully, completely, with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything he had decided to do, and what it felt like to Vandrima Noxus, who had spent 24 years being invisible in various creative configurations, was like the moment the cold stops feeling like cold and begins feeling like weight, like the moment before sleep after labor too long sustained, like the river catching dawn light and becoming something that appeared to generate its own illumination. She kissed him back. Her hands went to his chest, both of them as they had gone in the chamber that morning, and she felt his heart beneath her palms, the steady and somewhat accelerated beat of it, and she thought with the part of her mind that was still operational. He is not as composed as he appears. This thought was enormously satisfying. She was going to keep it. He pulled back by a fraction. Not away, just enough to look at her. His forehead came to hers, the gesture that had started at the river, the threshold that had become, it seemed, their particular language for this. And his hands were in her hair, in the braids, and she could feel his breath against her mouth, and the warmth of him was everywhere.
I have been thinking about that since the river.
Only since the river?
A pause, the expression that went all the way to his eyes.
Since the road.
She laughed. It was small, quiet, involuntary, the laugh of someone caught by something they didn't see coming, which was increasingly her experience of him in general. She felt him react to it, the very slight movement that went through him when she did something that surprised him, which she had also catalogued and also intended to keep.
The road. I looked extremely well on the road, frozen and horizontal and likely quite blue.
You looked like someone who had been walking north in a storm because the alternative was unacceptable. I found this very difficult to account for.
Is that what that was?
That was the beginning of it.
She looked at him. He looked at her. The afternoon light in the corridor was doing something generous to both of them, the gold of it warm and specific, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look the way it actually is rather than the way it has learned to present itself. She thought about the word her grandmother had taught her, the word for standing at the edge of something whose size you cannot yet determine. She had thought of it first on the night of the banquet, lying in the tent with the camp settling around her, and she thought of it now with the specific and slightly overwhelming clarity of someone who has stepped off the edge and discovered that the falling is not what the standing at the edge suggested it would be. It was not falling. It was the opposite of falling. It was, she thought, with the precision she brought to everything she decided to know, arriving. They emerged from the fort's interior corridor onto the lower parapet in the early evening, the sky above them the particular burning amber of a northern sunset that had decided, for once, to be entirely extravagant about it. The yard below was moving through its evening rhythms, the fort settling into the later day around them, and the world beyond the walls was doing the thing it always did in the north at this hour, going quiet and cold and spectacular in the way that only things that are genuinely, comprehensively indifferent to whether you appreciate them can be. She stood at the parapet wall and looked out at the landscape and felt the cold and the wind and the specific warmth of him standing at her side, and she thought about the road. About the drift. About walking north because north was away, and away was the only direction that had felt, at the time, like a direction at all. She had ended up here. She had no adequate framework for what here meant yet, what it would require, what it would become, what the days ahead of this one contained. She understood that the coalition would go home, and the old laws would have their record updated, and the world would continue to have opinions about what an Omega was and what she was allowed to be, and that none of those opinions had concluded their argument simply because this afternoon had gone the way it had. She understood that there was more of this, more rooms, more hearings, more of the world requiring her to be smaller than she intended to be. She was prepared to continue declining.
You should know, she said, to the landscape, to the amber sky, to the cold air and the parapet and the man standing warm beside her, that I am going to be a great deal of trouble.
I have been adequately warned.
I mean it. I have 24 years of small to make up for. I intend to take up considerable space.
It's good.
The council will have opinions.
The council often does.
And Oscar Larson?
Oscar Larson said something to Victor this afternoon that I was told about an hour ago. He said, and I am told this is a direct quotation, that she is either going to be an extraordinary queen or a catastrophic one, and that either way it will not be boring.
Vandrima turned to look at him.
He said queen.
He did?
Oscar Larson, who told you an Omega had no place?
The same. Victor seemed to feel this represented significant progress.
She stared at him. Then she turned back to the sky and pressed her lips together over the thing that was happening in her chest, which was enormous and complicated and involved several feelings simultaneously in a way that her usually organized inner landscape was not entirely prepared to accommodate. His arm came around her, not tentatively. He did not do tentative, she was learning, except in the specific and deliberate manner of a man who was slowing himself down on purpose because something was worth approaching with care. He pulled her into his side with the ease of someone for whom this was already natural, his arm solid and warm around her shoulders, and she went without resistance, which was something she would have found genuinely surprising 2 weeks ago, and now found simply true. She leaned into him. This too, this small, enormous, revolutionary act of leaning into someone rather than bracing against the world, was new. She was cataloging it. She was going to keep this one above all the others. The sun completed its descent beyond the western ridgeline, and the sky went from amber to rose to the deep, particular blue of northern early night, and the stars arrived the way they always did in this latitude, with the aggressive brightness of things that had been waiting for their turn, too many of them and too clear, the kind of sky that made the word vast feel insufficient. The fort below them lit its torches one by one, and the yard became a pattern of firelight and shadow that was, in its way, as beautiful as the river had been.
Stay, he said into her hair.
She turned her face up to look at him. He was looking down at her, and in the early night light, his expression was the unguarded one, the one she had first seen in the pre-dawn hour before the camp woke, the one that lived below the architecture of kingship and revealed the person underneath it, who was, she had discovered, someone she found entirely more interesting than the king.
You keep asking me that.
You keep answering.
Then perhaps we can take it as established.
He pressed his lips to her temple, slow and warm and deliberate, a touch that carried the accumulated weight of the river morning and the corridor and the hall of sacred flames and every gray-eyed look across a hall or a camp table or a pre-dawn corridor that had been saying, in the language that lived below words, the same thing it had said the first night at the roadside. She closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother, who had been dead for 12 years, and who had told her once, in the voice that was low and unhurried, and the specific warmth that no other memory had ever been able to replicate, that the world was made of two kinds of people, those who looked at an Omega and saw a limitation, and those who looked and saw something the world had not yet learned to name. She had not understood this fully at 12. She understood it entirely now. She opened her eyes. Below them, the fort lived and breathed and went about the organized business of its evening. In the great hall behind them, the remaining clan representatives were finishing their dinner with the specific energy of people whose mission had not succeeded and who were navigating the social topography of that outcome with various degrees of grace. In the corridor where it had happened, the afternoon light was gone, but the warmth of it remained in some way that was not thermal. The walls holding it, the way walls in old places hold the things that have been true in them, and on the parapet at the top of the fort, under a sky that had committed fully to the spectacular, Vandrima Noxus leaned into the arm of the Alpha King and looked out at the north, the dark hills and the frozen rivers and the vast, indifferent, extraordinary landscape of the place that had tried to kill her and had instead, in the manner of the North's particular sense of humor, simply been where this began. She had walked away from everything she knew with a cloak and a knife and a bone comb. She had arrived here. She was still learning the word for it. She thought her grandmother would have had it. She thought she would find it, in time, in the language of a life she was just beginning to build in the right direction, with space and warmth, and the specific, unhurried, devastating certainty of gray eyes that had looked at her in the snow and known, before she had known anything, that they were done looking. The night held them. The stars kept their counsel. And the north, which had always been a place of difficult things made beautiful by the quality of light they were viewed in, added this to its long record of things that had happened within it. A woman who had been thrown away, and a king who had stopped, and everything that had grown from those two facts in the space of an impossible winter. It was, perhaps, the most northern story ever told. And it was, at last, entirely hers. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale, full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.